Now on One, the main evening news at 9:50 with Martin Lewis.
The Prime Minister personally invites Ulster's leaders to security talks at number 10. He says that after the latest killings, politicians must lead the search for peace. An inquiry into why almost 1,000 cancer patients were given the wrong doses of radiation. And the stolen document that led to Paddy Ashdown's confession. A man is arrested. Good evening. John Major stepped into the maelstrom of Ulster politics today with an invitation to the leaders of the province's 4 main political parties. He invited them to join him and the Northern Ireland Secretary, Peter Brooke, in talks to try to stop the indiscriminate terrorist massacres which have reached a new intensity in recent weeks. The initiative was welcomed by Labour's Ulster spokesman, Kevin McNamara. It will be the first time for 16 years that a British Prime Minister has personally taken part in such discussions. Our political editor, John Cole, reports.
John Major's talks on security next week face one huge problem. His government's perception of the reality of terrorism in Ulster conflicts sharply with that of politicians who live there. He knows unionists believe escalating violence can only be stemmed by internment of those who run paramilitary organisations. But at question time, he irritated them by endorsing the importance of the political talks which recently broke down.
Does he really believe that if the politicians in Northern Ireland at this moment were sitting at a table, that the awful atrocities that we have witnessed in the past few days would not be taking place?
The Prime Minister's talks next week will concentrate on security, but he repeated his belief that Ulster politicians should talk together about peace. Mr Paisley retorted that Westminster had taken charge of security 20 years ago, so it must not blame Ulster politicians for its failures. A senior Tory sounded a solemn note.
The province is quite close to sliding into civil war between the communities, and if so, the security forces will find it difficult to hold the ring between them.
Did the authorities know who the godfathers were, and why did they reject internment?
Yes, of course it is the case that a significant number of those engaged in terrorism are known to the security forces, but it is also worth remarking that between 40 and 50% of those who are charged with terrorist crimes have no previous terrorist traces.
A Nationalist MP addressed the terrorists directly.
Nothing will ever be achieved through violence except the suffering that they have heaped on Northern Ireland. Have they the courage to call it off?
The Prime Minister will take the Ulster party leaders into his confidence about changes in security. But mostly he'll just listen, because it's their constituents who are being killed in increasing numbers. So far, Whitehall is saying that the drastic breakdown in public order which would justify internment is far off. But Peter Brooke also reminded MPs today that its introduction requires surprise.
The loyalist paramilitary group, the Ulster Defence Association, has said the IRA's attacks against Protestants must stop if the cycle of violence in Northern Ireland is to be broken. The UDA said that if the IRA held back, then the outlawed Ulster freedom fighters would not carry out attacks such as yesterday's at a Belfast bookmaker's in which 5 people were murdered.
Security hasn't been as heavy in Belfast for years, but extra anti-terrorist measures put in place yesterday morning couldn't stop the indiscriminate attack on the betting shop. The local community, like many others in the city, is very frightened. Through the day, more and more flowers were placed there, and 5 candles were put on the doorstep in memory of the murdered relatives, neighbours and friends. The family of 51-year-old Christopher Doherty, like many relatives of the other victims, can't forgive the killers.
Hell will never befall to the remit. That's all I can say. They're psychopaths.
What's your reaction to the fact that some people might feel that there needs to be some sort of retaliation for yesterday's...
Well, I wouldn't want any retaliation, although it's been said, there's a lot of people who say that, and they're not, these people don't listen to anybody. They just go ahead. But I wouldn't want anybody to the same thing to happen there.
The murders were carried out by the illegal loyalist group, the Ulster Freedom Fighters. For many, they're so close to the legal Ulster Defence Association that, as one nationalist politician said, they're the same men in different balaclavas. The UDA's leadership has been transformed in recent years. The old guard either dead, in prison or expelled by the new men. They're younger, more violent and determined to show they can hit back. The BBC questioned a spokesman for the UDA leadership today. He refused to appear on camera and said he couldn't speak on behalf of the UFF. But he said that if what he called the IRA's genocide against the Protestant community was to stop, then he said he could not see circumstances in which the UFF would carry out attacks anywhere. The paramilitary spokesman repeatedly quoted the murder by the IRA of 8 workmen near Cookstown last month as the kind of attack that he said has brought the Protestant community to breaking point. An IRA statement today claimed it would not be drawn into sectarian killings. In other words, they don't see the murder of these 8 Protestants as sectarian, rather, as the statement said, as part of a war with British forces. They want people to think their campaign's different, not to the view of the bereaved or of the community at large. IRA attacks will continue, retaliation inevitable, an apparently unbreakable cycle of revenge.
Albert Reynolds has been elected to succeed Charles Haughey as Prime Minister of the Irish Republic. Mr. Reynolds condemned yesterday's killings in Belfast as dreadful carnage and said he would work with the British government to try to end the cruelty of the conflict. Jim Dougal reports from Dublin.
This was Albert Reynolds' day, but for him, yesterday's killings in Belfast cast a shadow over the celebrations. The murders, he said, were the result of a twisted patriotism which sees death as the instrument of change.
Is that cruel carnage that has taken place over the last 36 hours must have shocked every decent Irish person, man or woman, and that we should not spare any effort to look in every direction, to take any possible initiative or move to try and put a stop to a situation where we had 27 deaths in the last 36 days. That cannot be ignored.
One of his first actions as Prime Minister, he said, will be to seek urgent talks with John Major. Earlier, on his last day as party leader, Charles Haughey also spoke of the need for a response.
We expect the British authorities to take every possible measure open to them, take all the steps available to them within the law.
It's obvious from Mr. Reynolds' comments that his government will see the security situation in Northern Ireland as a major priority. There's no question but that this will be welcomed by the authorities in Belfast and London. Jim Dougal, BBC News, Dublin.
A hospital in Stoke-on-Trent has admitted giving the wrong treatment to nearly 1,000 cancer patients over the last 9 years. Patients at the North Staffordshire Royal Infirmary received radiation doses up to 30% below the correct level because of an error by a physicist. Half of those treated have since died, but the hospital denies that the mistake put lives at risk.
The North Staffordshire Hospital has blamed human error for the mistake. It's thought that over the last 9 years, about 1,000 patients were given too little radiation with this machine. Some were given up to 1/3 less radiation than the doctors had prescribed. The error came to light when a new computer was being fitted. Physicists realized that the original computer had been wrongly set. The hospital denies lives have been put at risk.
We have not noticed any clinical effect over the last 10 years. An independent clinical assessment is being organized to look into each individual case and assess the results of treatment according to the tumor type.
Other radiation experts believe some patients may have been harmed. There's a difference between patients treated to reduce their pain and those doctors are trying to cure.
If all the patients were being treated in a palliative setting, he's right. Patients would not have been put at risk. If there are patients being treated for cure, then I would say that these patients are at significant risk.
Mrs. Lillian Clow's husband, who was treated at North Staffordshire, died of cancer. She's alarmed by what has happened.
Well, completely shocked. I just wonder whether my husband's had this treatment and if anything could have been done to save him. He was 54 when he died. It was a bit tragic.
It's not the first time wrong doses of radiotherapy have been given. 4 years ago at the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital, some patients were given 25% too much radiation over a 5-month period. Since then, more than 100 patients have been paid a total of over £1 million in damages by the Health Authority. At North Staffordshire this morning, hospital authorities revealed they had sent out 400 letters to patients explaining what had happened, and a telephone hotline has been set up for relatives of those who have died.
Have you had a letter from us?
Department of Health experts are investigating to see what lessons can be learned. But cancer doctors say radiotherapy departments need better qualified physicists to avoid similar problems in future. That can only be done by improving their pay and job prospects.
A man is being questioned by police in connection with the theft from a solicitor's office of a document relating to an affair between the Liberal Democrat leader Paddy Ashdown and his secretary. The Liberal Democrats' campaign manager Des Wilson has joined Labour's call for a coordinated police inquiry into a spate of similar break-ins.
The man arrested in Brighton arrived at Snow Hill Police Station in the City of London tonight for questioning over a burglary at Mr Ashdown's solicitors last month. The theft of a document revealing his brief relationship with his former secretary yesterday forced Mr Ashdown to go public about the affair. The woman involved, Tricia Howard, made her first public appearance today and made a statement through her lawyer.
She would like to say that she very much hopes that in return for making herself available to be photographed this morning, her family and she will be left alone to live a normal life, free from intolerable pressures and intrusions. Thank you very much.
Mrs Ashdown was also trying to put the matter behind her, stressing it had been a shock when she originally learned of the affair, but that was all 5 years ago. The Liberal Democrats themselves want to put a lid on this particular matter, but having compiled a list of other break-ins, they'll be campaigning now for a general investigation.
I would like to join the call from some Labour MPs yesterday that there is now a need for a proper, coordinated police inquiry into what is going on.
Usually it's lack of publicity which poses a problem for the Liberal Democrats. Today they had more than they wanted.
Ashdown! Mr.
Question time, MPs greeted Mr Ashdown with a sympathetic murmur. He'd been determined to get back to business as usual, refusing offers of a day off. Some felt he looked less confident than usual.
In recent times, the Liberal Democrats' popularity has been very closely linked with that of its leader. And some believe the important thing now is not Mr Ashdown's affair, but how well he can bounce back from his current difficulties.
Labour has accused the government of inventing a recovery that does not yet exist. During a Commons debate on the economy, Labour's Gordon Brown blamed the recession on Tory economic mismanagement. The Trade and Industry Secretary, Peter Lilly, said Labour's policies would aggravate the recession and told Mr Brown he was overdosing on gloom.
One of Labour's main priorities is to connect the recession with the policies of Mr Major. Recent polls suggest that most voters don't blame him for the current economic difficulties. This morning they claimed that while Mr Major and his Chancellor were making optimistic statements about the economy, it was moving deeper into recession. In the Commons, they challenged one of the government's main explanations for the recession, that other countries were facing similar difficulties, and mocked what they saw as the Conservatives' attempt to talk up the economy.
And after 13 years of government, they are no longer asking, how can they achieve better growth or better investment or better employment prospects? The highest aspiration in government is simply better advertising in the run-up to the election.
As well as citing global economic problems, the government argued the recession would be much worse under Labour. The Trade and Industry Secretary, Peter Lilly, accused Mr Brown of playing down Britain's successes.
The honourable member overdoses on gloom. He can't get enough of it. I fear that eventually it will consume him entirely.
But the Liberal Democrats agree with Labour that Mr Major must take some blame for the recession.
I mean, John Major, as number 2 to Nigel Lawson at the Treasury, was there when the credit boom was fuelled, which subsequently led to the brakes being applied, and the recession which has affected the country very deeply.
Mr Brown's speech has been widely praised, even by some Conservative MPs, which is encouraging news for Labour, because if they lose the argument over who's to blame for the recession, they're unlikely to win the election.
It's the second time this week that Labour has accused the government of being wrong about their predictions of an end to the recession. But, as our economist Steve Levinson reports, it's not just the government that's having to revise its forecasts.
At the time of the autumn statement last November, the Treasury was relying on consumers to lead the economy out of recession. Now, as the budget approaches, it's clear that's not happened. Economists at institutions highly thought of by the Treasury have had to put their hopes of recovery on ice. Last autumn, they shared the Treasury's optimism about growth. The Treasury then expected the total economy to grow this year by just over 2% and manufacturing output by over 3%. The London Business School's forecasts were almost identical. But new LBS forecasts, soon to be published, show growth this year will be much weaker, just over 1% overall and even less for manufacturing. Mr. Lamont's budget forecast will not be very different. Economists admit they were over-optimistic last year. They underestimated how reluctant consumers would be to spend money.
It's an irony that Mr. Major, when he was Chancellor, introduced a budget for saving. And that's precisely what households are doing now, increasing their savings.
The unexpected length of the recession has caught out even the best of British companies. ICI is the world's biggest paint maker. It's been particularly hit by the severity of the downturn in the housing market.
Our forecasts indicate that we won't be back to the sort of volumes that we were talking about for 1988 until roughly 1994-95.
Another industry facing a distinct lack of customers is defence. British Aerospace today announced it was laying off 450 workers, the latest in a long line of redundancies.
The government claimed this time last year the recession was nearing its end, then they claimed in the middle of the year we could see the end, and then they claimed towards the end of the year that it was over. Today's evidence, that it's far from over.
Recession and recovery already look like being the two words the politicians argue over most of all in the run-up to the election. But most economists and industrialists have already reached a consensus. It's that the recession is not yet over and the recovery will be slow.
Opinion polls in tomorrow's newspapers give conflicting indications of which party is in the lead. One puts the Conservatives 5 points ahead. The other suggests that Labour is ahead by 1 point. The Gallup poll for the Daily Telegraph suggests the Conservatives are on 42.5%, Labour on 37.5%, with the Liberal Democrats on 14%. The Conservatives are up 0.5% on last month's Gallup poll, Labour unchanged, and the Liberal Democrats down 2%. Gallup carried out its interviews from Saturday to Tuesday. But tomorrow's poll by Harris for the Daily Express, conducted after Paddy Ashdown's statement yesterday on his affair, puts the Conservatives just behind Labour on 39%. Labour are on 40% and the Liberal Democrats at 17%. That's a 2-point fall for the Conservatives, with Labour unchanged and the Liberal Democrats up 3%. Other recently published polls have shown narrow leads for the Conservatives and Labour. A man claiming to be the kidnapper of the estate agent Stephanie Slater has written to the police saying he didn't murder the Leeds teenager Julie Dart. Police haven't yet said whether they believe the letter's genuine, but they still think both crimes were committed by the same man.
News of the letters emerged as senior detectives from all over the country were gathering in Birmingham to discuss the possibility that the kidnapper might strike again. Assistant Chief Constable Tom Cook, the West Yorkshire officer heading the joint police investigation, left the conference to brief reporters on a new development. Mr. Cook disclosed that 7 letters had been sent to news media, the mother of Julie Dart, and the West Midlands Police. In the 3-page typewritten letter, which was unsigned, the writer admitted kidnapping Stephanie Slater, but denied killing Julie Dart. Mr. Cook was not persuaded.
The tone is one of regret and contrition that he's sorry for having put Stephanie through the deal in general terms. I think certainly one way, from my point of view, the positive way of interpreting that is that perhaps he feels threatened by the artist's impression and that we are getting a little closer to him, and it's almost, if you like, the beginnings of his defence and mitigation.
Mr. Cook said the man told them he carried a note around with him during the kidnap, detailing where he was holding Stephanie, just in case anything happened to him. All the letters were postmarked Sheffield. It was from somewhere close to the Sheffield Wednesday football ground that the kidnapper made a number of telephone calls. But the letters brought more pain for the Dart family.
We're all exhausted with all what's gone on, and then he's had the audacity to write to Lynn, to rub salt into the wounds of a girl. What's so sick of all this?
If the letters are genuine, The West Midlands and the West Yorkshire Police are faced with two possibilities. Either the kidnapper is lying when he denies any connection with the Julie Dart murder, or there has been a quite extraordinary series of coincidences in the two cases, a theory the police are not inclined to accept.
A government scheme to help bright children from poor families attend fee-paying schools has overspent its budget by £10 million. The figure would have been even higher if the remaining 6,000 places had been filled. Labour accused the government of writing blank cheques for private schools while state schools were underfunded.
The government's Assisted Places scheme subsidises pupils at independent schools like Bradford Grammar if their parents can't afford the fees. The scheme is controversial since both Labour and the Liberal Democrats want to abolish it. Today it emerged that the scheme has cost £75 million this year, an overspend of 15%. Increases in school fees and extra subsidies to parents hit by the recession were mainly to blame. Teachers' unions have accused the Education Secretary of double standards.
Well, I would say to Kenneth Clarke, treat the state schools with the same degree of flexibility and allow the state schools to overspend by 10, 15, maybe even 20%. And if we were allowed to do that, then that would solve many problems in the state school sector.
It's excellent value for money in that the boys and girls on the scheme get a very good education. They do consistently extremely well at examinations. A very high proportion, something like 85%, go on to higher education. And they are costing the taxpayer actually very little more than the cost of a secondary school place in the maintained system.
The independent schools argue that restricting or abolishing the scheme will make fee-paying schools the preserve of the wealthy. But Labour want to spend the money on children with special needs in state schools instead. They'll point to the rising costs and the fact that 6,000 places go unclaimed as evidence that the scheme's both unpopular and wasteful.
45 gay rights protesters have been arrested during a march in London. The demonstrators ignored police warnings that marches within a 1-mile radius of Westminster are forbidden while Parliament is sitting. Gay activists, including former Labour candidate Peter Tatchell, pop star Jimmy Somerville and filmmaker Derek Jarman, wanted to hand in a letter to the Prime Minister calling for a citizens' charter for gays and lesbians. A woman has been appointed for the first time as Director of Public Prosecutions. Barbara Mills, a leading criminal lawyer, is currently the Director of the Serious Fraud Office. She replaces Sir Alan Green, who resigned in disgrace last October.
Barbara Mills is taking on one of the most exposed and sensitive positions in the criminal justice system. As the senior prosecutor in England and Wales, she'll have the last word on whether people arrested by the police should face charges in court.
I'm very proud to have been appointed as the Director of Public Prosecutions. I have an extremely high regard for the Crown Prosecution Service, and it's a great honour to have been asked to head it. I shall, of course, be sorry to leave the Serious Fraud Office, which has proved itself to be a very important part of the prosecution system of this country.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's now 4 months since Alan Green resigned as DPP because he'd been stopped by the police for alleged curb crawling. This afternoon he said that Barbara Mills would make an outstanding DPP. The Attorney-General who appointed her said she'd bring zest and experience to the job.
By her appointment, it will be seen that we have in place, first of all, somebody who is a very specialised criminal lawyer, and secondly, somebody who has shown her ability to lead a service, albeit a smaller one, the Serious Fraud Office, and thirdly, somebody who has shown administrative ability.
Barbara Mills is 51. She's married to a Labour councillor and they have 4 grown-up children. As a barrister, she prosecuted Michael Fagan, who broke into the Queen's bedroom, and she defended Winston Silcott, who was accused of murdering P.C. Blakelock at Broadwater Farm. She became Director of the Serious Fraud Office in 1990. The Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. David Gandy, has worked hard to restore morale among prosecution staff since Alan Green's sudden resignation. He'll remain acting DPP until Barbara Mills' successor is appointed at the Serious Fraud Office. Mrs. Mills now faces the twin challenge of revitalising a prosecution service which got off to a very shaky start when it was launched nationally 5 years ago, and raising public confidence at a time when miscarriages of justice have provoked a fundamental review of the criminal justice system.
Environmentalists have warned that radioactive and toxic waste buried at sites near the coast could escape because of rising sea levels. A report today claims that many nuclear power stations and toxic waste dumps are at risk from flooding, which could damage underground storage chambers and release contaminated material.
Rising sea levels accompanied by unusually ferocious storms are both thought to be among the likely consequences of global warming and associated disruption of climate. Today's report says this would not only make large areas of coastline uninhabitable, but would put at risk nuclear power plants and poisonous waste sites around Britain's shores. There are 17 nuclear installations dotted around the coastline, including those at Sellafield, Sizewell and Hinkley Point. In addition, there are 4 major toxic waste depositories in low-lying areas believed to be vulnerable. According to the report, there are 3 ways in which rising sea levels could jeopardize coastal waste sites. In storm conditions, a swollen sea, breaking over the barriers, could broach the topsoil on the other side, exposing the toxic waste container. Alternatively, the water, shed from heavy seas, could sit on top of the waste chamber and, through sheer weight, penetrate the vessel, releasing its contents. As sea levels rise, so might the inshore water table, effectively immersing the waste container in corrosive brine. One of the participants at a meeting today of the group Climate Action Network has conducted research on the vulnerability to rising sea levels of nuclear plants like the one at Dungeness in Kent.
Some of them are only 5-6 metres above sea level, and that they are, in our estimation, at risk, not only from extreme water levels from storm surges now, but into the future.
The nuclear industry describes such fears as naive and rejects them.
The specific allegation as to the safety of our nuclear stations is the claim that we say is mistaken. We take safety extremely seriously, and flooding is one part of our safety analysis. And I can say categorically that there is no safety hazard from the potential rise in sea levels that has been suggested.
Apart from insisting that its coastal defences are secure, the nuclear power industry is turning the arguments on their head, contending that since their stations emit no carbon dioxide, they're not part of the global warming problem, but a major part of the solution.
Finally, cricket. Ian Botham has made a steady start in his 100th Test match. He scored 2 quick boundaries after New Zealand claimed an early English wicket on the second day of the 3rd Test in Wellington. After 40 minutes play, England are 263 for 6, with Botham on 9 and Dermot Reeve 11 not out. And tonight's main news again. The Prime Minister has invited leaders of the main parties in Northern Ireland for talks to discuss the recent spate of terrorist killings. Newsnight on BBC 2 at 10:30 tonight includes a discussion on the role of the monarchy. But that is the BBC News so far tonight. Good night.
This is BBC One. Now, North News with Simon Willis.
Good evening. The man accused of murdering an off-duty police officer by running him down in a stolen car has been cleared by a Newcastle Crown Court. Beverly Thompson reports.
Derek Johnston from West Denton in Newcastle always denied that he was the driver of the car that killed PC Duncan Clift. His acquittal came at the end of a 4-day trial. PC Clift, an officer with the Kent Constabulary, was in Hexham visiting his family last March. He was hit by this car after he tried to prevent its theft from a busy car park. He died from his injuries 2 days later. Northumbria police say it's too early to say if they will be reopening their inquiries.
It's been revealed that Wansbeck Council in Northumberland has taken 1/3 of its adult population to court for not paying the poll tax, the highest figure in the country. Since the tax started, 26,000 summonses have been issued, with some people getting more than one.
The procedure is that there's a £5 summons cost added to the account.
Councillors say they resent government accusations that they are not trying hard enough to collect.
They implemented it. Unfortunately, we are the ones that have actually got to administer the damn tax. And as a result of that, that brings us face to face with the public.
Carlisle's Labour MP, Eric Martlew, fears that a planned boundary revision could cost him his seat. Labour hold Carlisle by just 916 votes. After the next election, the constituency could be extended to include 4 rural areas from the neighbouring Penrith and the Border constituency, where voters in the past have tended to support the Conservatives. And that's Thursday's North News. We're back in the morning, though tonight's next bulletin is on BBC Local Radio's Night Network. Tonight's weather forecast comes from Bill Giles. From all of us in Newcastle, good night to you.
A very good evening to you. In the last few hours, we've started to see the cloud beginning to break up in parts of southern England. This means there could well be a few mist and fog patches around, and as well as that, the temperatures are going down a shade too, so just a chance of a touch of frost. This really is from parts of southeast England through central southern England, perhaps across to eastern parts of Devon. So the combination of the two could mean some icy stretches on untreated roads, but I'd like to stress the fact that it will be very, very patchy indeed. Now, further north, the temperature is likely to stay well above freezing. The winds are stronger up there. And indeed, there's a fair amount of cloud too. So that'll help to keep the temperatures up. And in the far north, they're pretty windy weather with some outbreaks of rain right the way through the night. Well, that's what the weather map is going to look like by midday tomorrow. High pressure beginning to pull away just a shade. A fair number of isobars across the chart, so beginning to get quite windy. And we're going to start to see the weather change. This one, in fact, is a fairly weak affair as it comes down across northern parts. But this is the weather front, which is going to completely change the weather as we go through the weekend. You can see it pushing in. It's going to bring very wet, very windy weather across most places. And on Sunday, particularly as the winds turn into the northwest, so it's going to get very much colder. We can see that a cloud already beginning to develop off the eastern seaboard of the States. There it is, a good deal of cloud and rain, and it's going to get more and more as it pushes its way further and further across the Atlantic, so we've got that to come. Tomorrow morning, though, the mist and fog in the south are clearing away. Then a fairly bright day with a bit of sunshine. Although in Scotland, we're going to find some wet and windy weather pushing its way down into the borders, some quite strong winds associated with it too. But a very mild day, as you can see, temperatures almost up to double figures in most places, 11 degrees Celsius down in the south, perhaps up in the Moray Firth as well. Saturday then, a good deal of cloud, a little bit of brightness around, but rain sweeping its way in, getting to all but the eastern side by the end of Saturday. And then on Sunday, turning rather more showery, turning a lot colder too. I think you're going to start to see some welcome snow up in the ski resorts up in the northern part of Scotland. Well, that's it from me. Bye-bye for now.
Now, while the cat's away... He's quite a character, your Frank Carver, isn't he? How long have you been together?
Together isn't exactly the word.
Really?
He's up to something, isn't he?
If Tessa is in Africa and I am in Honolulu, I wonder where Frank is.
The mouse is at play.
I'm playing on my own ground here. What? The shower units won't mind.
Love Hurts. Tomorrow, 9:30. BBC One.
On BBC Two now, former Iranian prisoner Roger Cooper, who served 6 years on charges of espionage, asks himself the questions no one else dared to ask. This is BBC One, where we now join Peter Sissons for Question Time.